The school bell rang, signaling the end of the day. Students filtered out of classrooms, their laughter echoing through the hallways, a familiar soundtrack to the end of another school year. The air was thick with the kind of tension that accompanies the approach of summer. Graduation was near, and the promise of freedom filled the air. But for Maria Rodriguez, it was the last day she would walk those hallways. The last day she would see her friends, her teachers, her school. No one knew it then, not even Maria herself. She had been looking forward to the summer, a new chapter, her future laid out before her like a blank canvas. Maria was the kind of person people naturally gravitated towards. A senior with a quiet, radiant confidence. She wasn't the loudest in the room, but she always had a presence. She had friends, a close-knit group of girls who called her their rock. They'd known each other for years, shared their hopes, fears, and everything in between. And yet, there was always something mysterious about Maria, something that even those closest to her couldn't quite figure out. She had a way of disappearing into herself sometimes, retreating behind a wall that no one could quite break down. That day was no different. Maria smiled as she passed through the halls, exchanging hugs and high fives with classmates who were ready to embark on their own paths. But there was something in her eyes, something different, a look that lingered as if she were already somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the noise of high school life. The day ended like any other, with the final bell ringing, signaling the end of class. But as the students poured into the parking lot, Maria didn't join them. She didn't head to the carpool where her mother usually picked her up, and she didn't meet up with her friends to grab an early dinner before heading home. The quiet of the school after hours was like a shroud that descended quickly, a stark contrast to the rush and excitement of the day. Teachers packed their things, their minds already on their own summer plans, not noticing anything out of the ordinary. The security guard on duty locked up the doors and did his rounds, his flashlight slicing through the shadows. It was routine, mundane, a final check of the premises before heading home. Maria's absence wasn't noted right away. It was just another day in the life of a school. A student who didn't show up for a ride home, an absence that would be forgotten in the rush of the day's events. But as hours passed and night fell, Maria's absence began to feel heavier. By the time her mother, Eva Rodriguez, arrived home and didn't find Maria there, a small seed of concern took root. Eva wasn't overly worried at first. Maria had always been the independent type, prone to staying late at school, sometimes to study or work on projects. But as the night stretched on and Maria still didn't return home, a sense of unease started to creep in. It wasn't like Maria to just vanish without so much as a word. Eva tried calling Maria's cell phone, but the line went straight to voicemail. She tried again, and again. The calls were never answered. By the time midnight rolled around, Eva's worry had turned into fear. Something wasn't right. The house felt empty, without Maria's presence. At first light, Eva called the school. The administrators were just starting their day, unaware of the growing tension. They assured her that Maria might have stayed with a friend or was at a late study session. But when Eva insisted something was wrong, the school finally contacted the local police. The response was slow, almost dismissive at first. After all, teenagers often ran off, didn't they? They disappeared for a few hours, sometimes even days. It wasn't uncommon, not in the world of a high school. But as hours turned into a full day with no word from Maria, the authorities began to take the situation more seriously. Investigators arrived at the school and immediately began questioning staff and students. They asked Maria's friends about her behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. No one had noticed anything out of the ordinary. Maria had been her usual self, quiet, thoughtful, a bit withdrawn at times, but never showing any signs that something was wrong. Her friends had seen her in the morning, laughed with her between classes. There was no indication that Maria had been upset, anxious, or in any danger. There were no signs of a struggle, no arguments, no warning signs. The initial investigation didn't yield much. No one had seen anything suspicious. The school security cameras, at least the ones on the exterior, hadn't picked up anything unusual. Maria had simply vanished. The days following her disappearance were filled with a growing sense of confusion, a sense of helplessness. Where had she gone? Had she run away? The town's small police force was stretched thin, and the investigation was slow. Every lead turned cold. There were no ransom notes, no witnesses, nothing to suggest foul play. The days turned into weeks. The school year wrapped up without Maria, but the absence left a hole in the community. Friends, classmates, even teachers felt the weight of her disappearance. Rumors spread and suspicions grew. Some thought Maria had simply decided to leave, but no one could believe that. She had been planning her future, looking forward to graduation. Her family was devastated, but the town was divided. Some wanted to believe she had run off. Others feared the worst. And as the weeks dragged on, the case grew colder and the community moved on, grief and uncertainty lingering like an uncomfortable shadow. But one thing remained in the background, quietly simmering in the forgotten corners of the investigation: the school security footage. At the time, the school security system was outdated, old tapes that had been barely reviewed, if at all. They had assumed that nothing significant would be found. It was the kind of thing no one thought to look at, until one day, months after Maria's disappearance, a maintenance worker, tasked with cleaning out the school storage rooms, stumbled across something strange. As the worker moved boxes and old files, he found a stack of dusty security tapes. Tapes that had been recorded during the final days of the school year. One tape, labeled with the date of Maria's disappearance, caught his eye. Curious, he decided to take a look. The footage was grainy, the image flickering, but it was clear enough to see Maria walking down the hallway a few minutes before the bell had rung. She was heading toward the exit, her posture straight, calm. Then, just as she turned a corner, the footage cut off, disappearing into static. It was a jarring moment. The tape held a promise of an answer, of closure, but it also opened up more questions than it answered. What had happened after Maria walked out of frame? Why was the footage so suddenly interrupted? And why had no one thought to check the tapes before? When the investigators saw the footage, they were stunned. Here was the one piece of evidence they had been hoping for, the final moments before Maria's disappearance. Yet the tape was as much of a mystery as Maria's vanishing. The interruption in the footage felt intentional, like someone had deliberately cut the tape off at the exact moment when something significant might have happened. But who and why? It became clear that the disappearance of Maria Rodriguez was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The forgotten security tape didn't just offer a glimmer of hope, it deepened the mystery. Now, with new leads, the investigation would take a different turn, one that would unravel old secrets, expose hidden tensions, and eventually lead to a shocking revelation that no one had seen coming. Maria's vanishing was far from the simple case of a missing girl. It was the beginning of a long, twisting road into the dark corners of the high school, the community, and the very people who had once been closest to her. The tapes had revealed only a small part of the story, but it was enough to push the investigation forward. There would be no more waiting, no more accepting that Maria had simply disappeared into the ether. The answers were out there, somewhere hidden in the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before someone uncovered them. Months had passed since Maria Rodriguez disappeared, and yet the case still hung heavily over the small town like an unwelcome cloud. The investigation had stalled, every lead turning cold. The police had done their best to piece together the fractured fragments of Maria's life and the few clues she had left behind. But there was little to go on. Her family, desperate for answers, clung to the hope that one day, somehow, they would find her. But with each passing day, that hope was slipping further away. In the quiet hum of daily life, Maria's absence began to fade from the collective memory. People moved on. Life, in its strange way, insisted on going forward, no matter how many questions remained. Then one day, something unexpected happened. The school's janitor, a quiet man who mostly kept to himself, was doing his routine cleaning in the storage rooms when he stumbled across something strange. In a dusty corner of a forgotten filing cabinet, he found a stack of old security tapes. The tapes were buried under a pile of discarded papers and boxes, their labels fading with time. They hadn't been touched in years. Most of the tapes were from previous years, all from the school's outdated surveillance system. They weren't the sort of thing anyone would pay attention to. But something about the date on one of the tapes caught the janitor's eye. It was labeled with the exact day Maria disappeared. Curious, he took the tape to the security office. thinking it might be worth checking. It was an odd thing to do, but perhaps the old footage could reveal something that everyone else had missed. When the security team reviewed the tape, they found something they never expected. The video was grainy and difficult to decipher, but it showed Maria walking down a hallway just a few minutes before the final bell rang. She was carrying her bag, her posture straight, almost serene, with a slight smile on her face, as though she had already accepted the inevitability of the end of school. The hallway was mostly empty. The few students who lingered had already begun to scatter. It looked like an ordinary moment, a snapshot of a young woman finishing her day. But then, just as she turned a corner, the footage suddenly cut to black. Static filled the screen and the recording ceased. The abruptness of it was jarring. It wasn't just a technical glitch or an unfortunate camera malfunction. This felt different. It was as though someone had deliberately ended the recording at that exact moment. There was no sound of footsteps, no lingering image of Maria fading out of view, just a sudden, violent interruption, as though the tape itself had been violently ripped from the timeline. The footage, in all its grainy obscurity, held more questions than answers. What happened next? Was Maria followed? Did she leave the building of her own accord? Or was something more sinister at play? The discovery of this footage was enough to send a ripple of renewed energy through the investigation. Finally, there was something, an actual piece of evidence that might hold the key to unlocking the mystery of her disappearance. The tape became the focal point of the investigation, but as the investigators analyzed it frame by frame, the questions only multiplied. Why had no one thought to review these tapes sooner? The footage had been sitting in storage for months. The investigation had been dragging, and in those months, everything felt like it had been a fruitless search. Now, after all this time, they were faced with video that held so much promise, but revealed so little. The tape became a symbol of what had been overlooked, of what was hidden in plain sight. It was easy to blame the outdated security system, the forgotten nature of the footage, the long hours the investigators had spent chasing dead leads. But the more they dug, the more they realized how crucial this tape was. It wasn't just a forgotten piece of evidence. It was the only thing that could give them a glimpse into the last moments of Maria's life. And yet, it told them nothing beyond the fact that Maria had been there, walking through the halls, unaware that her life was about to change forever. The footage, in its eerie silence, became a haunting reminder of how the simplest things could slip through the cracks. The police worked tirelessly to enhance the footage, to clear up the static and reveal more of what had happened. But the more they tried, the more elusive the tape became. There was no sign of anyone following Maria, no hint of danger. The hallway was empty, still, except for Maria. It was a kind of footage that offered the bare minimum, a fleeting glimpse into the ordinary that now seemed extraordinary because of the unanswered questions it raised. What had happened to her after that last frame? Had she been abducted, or had she left willingly? If something sinister had occurred, why was the tape cut at such a crucial moment? Was someone in the school involved, or had it been a stranger? As they examined the footage, a sense of unease began to settle over the investigation. The tape was only a fragment, a sliver of time that was, for all intents and purposes, meaningless without context. The police started to question whether someone had intentionally tampered with the tape, cutting it off right before something significant could be seen. But who would have had access to footage? Who would have had the motive to hide the truth? Was it a school staff member? Someone who had a reason to make the footage disappear? Or was it an external force, someone who knew exactly what to look for and when to strike? The more the investigators pondered these questions, the more frustrated they became. They weren't sure where to look next. They had no answers, just more confusion. Maria's disappearance, once thought to be a simple missing persons case, now seemed much more complex. The tape had opened up new possibilities, but none of them were comforting. It seemed that every answer only led to more questions, and the deeper they dug, the further they seemed to be from the truth. As the days went on, the emotional weight of the case began to sink in. The family, still reeling from the shock of losing Maria, watched helplessly as the investigation stumbled forward. Maria's mother, Eva, had always been proud of her daughter's independence. She knew that Maria had been the kind of person who could take care of herself, but she never imagined that Maria would just vanish without a trace. The questions gnawed at her every day. Had Maria run away? Had she been kidnapped? If so, by whom? And most painfully, why? Eva found herself unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything other than the image of her daughter walking to the school halls that last day, her figure fading into the grainy static. That image haunted her, because she knew deep down that something had happened after that last frame. But what? With the new discovery, the case began to take on a new direction. The forgotten tape had reignited hope, but that hope was tempered by the realization that the truth might not be as simple as anyone had hoped. There was more to Maria's disappearance than met the eye. The questions had only multiplied. And the one thing everyone wanted to know, the one thing they desperately needed, was just out of reach. The answers lay hidden in those final, forgotten moments, locked away in the static of the tape. In the quiet aftermath of the tape's discovery, the investigation felt like it was beginning again, only now the stakes were higher. With each unanswered question, the emotional tension grew. It was as if the past months had been spent chasing shadows, and the only thing that kept everyone going was a hope that somewhere, deep in the mystery, there was an answer, and somewhere, perhaps in those few seconds of footage, the key to Maria's fate waited to be discovered. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that the footage, for all its potential, was not going to give them the answer they sought. It would take more than forgotten security tape to unlock the truth behind Maria's disappearance. The mystery was far from over, and the town would soon learn that the answers they were looking for would come from places they hadn't even begun to consider. But one thing was certain. The discovery of the tape had breathed new life into the case, and with it, the hope that Maria's story wasn't finished yet. The newly discovered security footage had brought a spark of hope to an investigation that had long since begun to fade into the background of the town's collective memory. For months, the case of Maria Rodriguez's disappearance had grown colder, slipping further from the public's mind as other news stories began to take precedence. The police, while still working diligently, were no closer to understanding what had happened to Maria. The lack of evidence and witnesses made it seem almost impossible that they would ever get answers. But the footage, the single grainy frame, changed everything. It was a breadcrumb, a small piece of something that might lead them to the truth. But as the investigators pored over the tape, they soon realized that it didn't provide the answers they had hoped for. Instead, it only raised more questions. The footage, while showing Maria walking down the hallway just moments before her disappearance, was eerily devoid of anything even remotely suspicious. She moved with the casual grace of someone finishing a normal school day, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty corridor. She smiled, perhaps in passing recognition of a familiar face, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. And then, just as she turned the corner to exit the frame, the tape was abruptly cut off. Static filled the screen, and that was all. No struggle, no sign of danger, no clues as to what had happened next. For all intents and purposes, the tape showed a completely ordinary moment, one that might have been easily dismissed were it not for the fact that it was the last known footage of Maria. The investigators, initially hopeful that they had finally discovered something substantial, were left perplexed. They enhanced the footage, replayed it frame by frame, searching for any clue, any hint of what had happened in the moments after Maria left the frame. But there was nothing. The tape offered no new insights, no revealing glimpses of the truth. All there were questions that had only grown deeper. Why had the tape been cut off so suddenly? Was it just a technical malfunction? Or had someone deliberately stopped the recording at that moment? If it had been tampered with, who had done it, and why? As they dug into the origins of the tape, the investigators uncovered something that added another layer of complexity to the mystery. The school security system had been outdated, its cameras old and unreliable. The tapes had not been reviewed immediately after Maria's disappearance, and the footage had sat untouched for months, gathering dust in a forgotten corner of the school's storage room. The fact that the tape had been overlooked for so long seemed almost impossible. How could something so critical, something that could have answered so many questions, have been left behind, forgotten by the very people who should have been actively searching for answers? The realization was frustrating. It was a simple mistake, one that no one could have predicted, and yet it was the key to everything. But even with this new revelation, the tape still didn't provide the closure they needed. The school security footage had become the focal point of the investigation, the one shred of evidence that had the potential to crack the case wide open. But now, it seemed to hold more questions than answers. The tape was essentially useless in terms of providing a clear timeline of what had happened to Maria, and it did nothing to shed light on the mystery of her disappearance. What was the significance of those last moments before the footage cut out? What had Maria been doing in the final seconds that were forever lost in the static? The investigators began to consider the possibility that the tape had been intentionally tampered with. This theory was hard to dismiss, especially when they learned that the school security system was in disarray. The cameras had been unreliable for years, and there was a long history of footage being lost or corrupted. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that someone in the school had probably seen something, had known something, and had decided to hide it. The very idea that someone in the school might be involved in Maria's disappearance was chilling. It was the kind of thought that no one wanted to entertain, but it was a possibility that couldn't be ignored. As the investigation shifted its focus to this new theory, the question on everyone's mind was, who had been in the school that day, and who might have had the opportunity to tamper with the tape? The school staff, while cooperative, began to be scrutinized more closely. There were teachers and janitors who had access to security footage, and there were a few staff members who had been in the building late that afternoon. It was a stretch to think that anyone within the school had been directly involved in Maria's disappearance, but the more they investigated, the more they realized that the people closest to the scene might have known more than they were letting on. At the same time, the investigators began to question the students. Maria had been well-liked, but she had also been involved in a few conflicts with some of her classmates. Most notably, there was Kyle, a student who had always been on the fringes of the school's social circles. Kyle had been known for his erratic behavior and his tendency to clash with others. There had been rumors of a rivalry between him and Maria, though no one could pinpoint exactly what had sparked it. Some of Maria's friends described Kyle as someone who had often made her uncomfortable, a person who seemed to hover around the edges of her life in a way that was unsettling. But had this rivalry been enough to drive him to violence? And if so, what role had the school and its faulty security system played in covering up the truth? The investigation turned inward, with police starting to re-examine the people closest to Maria. They spoke to her friend again, hoping to uncover anything that might explain her strange disappearance. They learned that Maria had been particularly distant in the weeks leading up to her vanishing. She had been withdrawn, more introspective than usual, and her friends recalled that she had seemed troubled, though none of them had known the exact cause. They remembered that she had been spending more time alone in the days before graduation, which was unlike her. Maria had always been someone who thrived in social settings, and her sudden withdrawal was out of character. The more her friends spoke about these odd changes in her behavior, the more it seemed that something had been brewing beneath the surface, something no one had noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to notice. But the most unsettling part of the investigation was a growing sense that Maria had known something that might have been a reason for her disappearance. Had she seen something or heard something that had made her feel unsafe? Had she been in a position where she had no choice but to leave, to disappear in order to protect herself? The idea that Maria might have been running from something she couldn't escape became an undercurrent in the investigation, a nagging feeling that there was more to her disappearance than anyone had been able to understand. As the weeks wore on and the investigation continued to focus on the school security footage, it became clear that the case was not going to be solved easily. The tape had promised answers, but it had only led to more confusion. The footage didn't give the investigators a clear answer, and neither did the growing list of questions about the people who might have been involved. Every new lead seemed to unravel more mysteries, as though the investigation were unpeeling layers of story that had yet to reveal its true shape. And so, the case of Maria Rodriguez's disappearance remained a puzzle, a haunting, unfinished puzzle with no easy solution. The footage, for all its potential, had only deepened the mystery, leaving everyone involved in the case with more questions than they had when they started. The police, Maria's family, and even the community at large were left to wonder what had happened to her in those final moments before she vanished from view, and what had been hidden from them all this time, waiting to be uncovered in the shadows of an old, forgotten security tape. As the investigation into Maria Rodriguez's disappearance unfolded, a new thread began to unravel, one that would change the course of the inquiry entirely. It was a name that kept surfacing in conversations, a name that sent a ripple of unease through Maria's friends and classmates. Kyle. He had always been somewhat of an outsider, an enigmatic figure who didn't quite fit into the typical social fabric of the school. Kyle was the kind of person who hovered around the periphery of groups, never fully accepted, never quite ignored, but always just a little too far removed from the rest. His reputation was built on an unsettling combination of unpredictability and secrecy. He was known for his temper, his mood swings, and his strange behavior, which some chalked up to youthful rebellion, but others had always felt something darker lingering beneath the surface. Maria had never been one to show her discomfort, at least not openly, but when the police began to probe into her relationships, her friends recalled moments when Maria had seemed unnerved by Kyle's attention. It wasn't obvious to everyone at first, but looking back, there were signs that Maria had been subtly avoiding him in the weeks before she vanished. He would often show up uninvited, hanging around her locker, waiting for her after class, watching her from across the room. The behavior had always struck her friends as strange, but no one had really given it much thought. It was just another quirky aspect of Kyle, something that might have been dismissed as a symptom of his troubled nature. But in the days following Maria's disappearance, as the pieces of her life were slowly revealed to the eyes of those who had known her, the more her friends began to realize how uncomfortable Maria had been with Kyle's presence. Some of them had brushed it off as typical high school drama. But now, in light of the mounting evidence that Maria's disappearance might not have been as simple as it seemed, they began to connect the dots. Maria had distanced herself from Kyle in a way that wasn't just about avoiding an uncomfortable friendship. There had been something more. The police quickly learned that Maria had been involved in a strange and silent rivalry with Kyle, one that had remained mostly hidden from view. Neither of them had ever openly acknowledged it, but there had been tension between them in the months leading up to her disappearance. Kyle, with his abrasive demeanor and strange obsessions, had become fixated on Maria. At first, the fixation had been easy to overlook. Kyle had a tendency to fixate on people, to latch onto certain individuals and insert himself into their lives without warning. But with Maria, it was different. His attention toward her had become more persistent, more unnerving. He had started showing up at places where she didn't expect him, at the library, near the lunchroom, outside her house, lurking on the edges of her social circles. What had started as simple curiosity turned into something more unsettling. Maria, ever the composed young woman, had kept her discomfort to herself, preferring to deal with it quietly, not wanting to escalate the situation or cause a scene. She had always been good at managing her relationships, keeping things cordial, avoiding confrontation. But now, in the wake of her disappearance, it was becoming painfully clear that Kyle's interest in her had crossed a line, and the fact that no one had really noticed or had failed to take it seriously made the whole situation feel even more tragic. As the investigation continued to peel back the layers of Maria's life, Kyle's name came up again and again. A few of Maria's friends admitted that there had been a few strange encounters with him, times when he'd come too close, times when his behavior had made them uneasy, but none of them had thought much of it at the time. It wasn't until the investigation had shifted its focus to Kyle that everyone started to realize how much had been overlooked. The fact that Maria had been subtly trying to distance herself from him in the weeks before she vanished now seemed like a significant red flag. The investigators dug deeper into Kyle's background, speaking with his teachers, his family, and his peers. They learned that he had a history of behavioral problems. He had been expelled from a few different schools over the years for violent outbursts, for making threats, and for exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. His reputation had always been that of a troublemaker, but few had ever taken him seriously. He had been the kind of student who floated in and out of trouble, without ever fully sinking into it, never quite crossing the line enough to warrant serious intervention. But now, in light of Maria's disappearance, the pieces of his history began to fit into a much darker narrative. His troubled past wasn't just a string of incidents. It was a pattern that seemed to suggest something more sinister. His temper, his social isolation, his inability to form lasting, healthy relationships. All of it painted a picture of a person who had never quite learned how to navigate the complex emotional terrain of human connection. Instead, he had resorted to using force, manipulation, and intimidation to get what he wanted. And Maria had been the latest person to fall into his web. Kyle's relationship with Maria or rather his obsession with her, had escalated over time. It wasn't clear exactly when things had crossed the line, but there were whispers among the student body about a confrontation that had taken place in the days before her disappearance. According to several students who had been around, there had been an argument between the two of them. It was a quiet argument, one that hadn't attracted much attention at the time, but now, in hindsight, it seemed to hold more weight than anyone had realized. The argument had been about something trivial, something about a passing comment that Maria had made, something that Kyle had misinterpreted. But in the moment, it had been more than just a disagreement. Kyle had become visibly agitated, his temper flaring as he confronted Maria in front of a group of students. The incident had been enough to make those who witnessed it uncomfortable, but it hadn't seemed like the kind of thing that would spiral into something dangerous. Everyone had assumed it was just another high school spat, a one-off event that would blow over. But now, the police realized that this incident had been a warning sign, a sign that Kyle's obsession with Maria had moved from passive interest to something darker, more aggressive. The emotional tension between the two of them had reached a boiling point in the days leading up to Maria's disappearance. And yet, there were still so many questions that remained unanswered. What had happened after the argument? Had Maria been aware of the danger she was in? Did she try to reach out to someone for help? And why had no one noticed the mounting pressure she was under? As the investigation focused more on Kyle, the emotional weight of the case grew even heavier. The investigators began to question the people closest to him, try to understand what had been going on in his mind. They spoke to his family, his friends, and his teachers, trying to piece together a timeline of his actions in the days leading up to Maria's disappearance. They discovered that Kyle had been acting erratically in the days before she vanished. He had been seen around the school late at night, wandering the halls in the days, his eyes wild and unfocused. No one had thought to ask him why he was there. It was just another strange quirk of his, something that fit into the pattern of his odd behavior. But now, in the context of the investigation, those late-night appearances began to feel far more significant. Had Kyle been waiting for Maria? Had he been stalking her, planning his next move? The more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized that Kyle's obsession with Maria had been simmering beneath the surface for much longer than anyone had realized. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, it seemed painfully clear that the pieces had all been there, hidden in plain sight, like an ominous shadow lurking just out of view. Maria had tried to navigate her life in the midst of it, try to manage Kyle's presence in her world without fully confronting it. She had tried to keep things normal, to keep things calm, to avoid confrontation. But Kyle's obsession had grown too strong, and it seemed that no matter how hard Maria tried, she could never fully escape it. The investigation now had a new focus. The emotional complexity of the situation had deepened. Maria's disappearance was no longer just a case of a missing person. It had become a case of obsession, of fear, of human darkness. And as the police began to turn their attention to Kyle, the shadows of the past began to emerge, revealing the disturbing undercurrent of a story that had been hiding in plain sight. As the investigation into Maria's disappearance began to center more on Kyle, the chilling realization of his involvement slowly took shape. The police had long suspected that the case was far from ordinary, but now, with the mounting evidence pointing toward him, they could no longer ignore the possibility that Kyle had played a direct role in what had happened to Maria. The narrative was starting to shift from a mysterious vanishing to something darker, a story of obsession, tension, and ultimately, tragedy. Maria had always been the type of person who tried to make the best out of difficult situations, but in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, she had become more withdrawn, increasingly avoiding the very people who could have helped her. It was in this period of isolation, when Maria had started to distance herself from Kyle, that the seeds of his obsession had truly begun to grow, leading him down a path that would eventually result in the devastating events that followed. Maria had always been a composed young woman, someone who carried herself with quiet confidence. But her friends, looking back with hindsight, noticed how she had been more anxious in the weeks before she disappeared. It was as if she were carrying a burden no one could see. Her friends had brushed it off at the time as normal pre-graduation jitters, excitement mixed with the anxiety of the unknown. But now, as the police delved deeper into Kyle's past and his obsession with Maria, those subtle shifts in her behavior began to take on new meaning. Maria had tried to protect those around her from the weight of her struggles, But perhaps she had known all along that something was amiss. Perhaps that was why she had begun to pull away from him, hoping that by creating distance, she might be able to escape his gaze. The more the police uncovered about Kyle's history, the more disturbing the picture became. His past was filled with incidents that, in hindsight, seemed to fit the pattern of his obsession with Maria. Kyle had always been a loner, never quite able to fit into the social circles of the school. He wasn't the type of person who could easily make friends, and instead, he clung to the few people who showed him any attention. His relationships were often fraught with tension. He would latch onto individuals, becoming almost possessive, unable to let go when they started to drift away. His behavior wasn't just a reflection of youthful rebellion, as many had assumed. It was something deeper, something darker. There were reports of him becoming angry when he felt ignored, when people rejected him or refused to engage with him in the way he wanted. These incidents, while troubling, were often written off as the growing pains of a troubled teenager. But with the investigation now focused on him, it was clear that these were warning signs of a much deeper issue. Kyle's fixation on Maria had started in a seemingly innocent way, or at least that's how it had appeared at first. He had seen her as someone who could understand him, someone who might offer him the companionship he so desperately sought. At first, his attention was subtle, casual even, but over time his fixation grew. He began to show up wherever she was, always lurking at the edge of her conversations, sitting in the same areas during lunch or standing nearby in the hallways, watching her. It was as if he were trying to insert himself into her life in a way that made her uncomfortable, but was so subtle that she could never truly confront it. Maria, always polite, always trying to maintain peace, had never directly addressed Kyle's behavior. She had hoped that with time, his attention would wane, that the awkwardness would fade on its own. But it didn't. It only grew stronger, more insistent. And as it did, Maria began to sense something more sinister lurking beneath his gaze. She had tried to confront him once, but it hadn't gone as she had hoped. Kyle's temper had flared during their brief exchange, and though it had ended without major incident, Maria had been left shaken. She had started to avoid him, to steer clear of his presence whenever possible. Her friends had noticed a shift, but at the time, they had chalked it up to typical high school drama, not fully understanding the depth of the situation. Maria had kept her discomfort hidden, perhaps too well. She didn't want to burden anyone, didn't want to appear weak or paranoid. So she had chosen silence, hoping that her subtle withdrawal would be enough to distance herself from him. It was only after the police started to investigate Kyle more thoroughly that the true extent of his obsession came to light. The detectives interviewed several people who had witnessed Kyle's strange behavior, and it became apparent that his fixation on Maria was much deeper than anyone had realized. There were reports of him watching her from a distance, following her after school, and even showing up at places she frequented without any apparent reason. It was clear now that Kyle had become obsessed with Maria, and that obsession had taken on an unhealthy, dangerous edge. The unsettling part was that, despite his strange and increasingly obsessive behavior, no one had done enough to intervene. His actions had been dismissed as part of his troubled nature, his inability to fit in, but no one had considered the possibility that those behaviors could escalate into something far more harmful. As the police began to piece together the timeline of events leading up to Maria's disappearance, they learned that the days before her vanishing had been marked by increasingly odd and aggressive behavior from Kyle. It was as though he could sense that Maria was pulling away from him, that she was finally recognizing the danger of his obsession. His anxiety grew as he realized that his control over her was slipping. And in those final days, as Maria made her efforts to distance herself from him, Kyle's fixation reached its peak. It wasn't just about following her anymore. It had become something darker, more desperate. He couldn't stand the idea of losing her, even if it meant doing whatever it took to make her stay in his orbit. In the aftermath of her disappearance, Kyle had initially acted as though he were concerned, like any other classmate might. He spoke to Maria's friends, pretending to care, offering support in the same detached manner that he'd always carried himself. But there was something about the way he spoke that unsettled those around him. His words fell hollow, as though he were trying too hard to appear sympathetic, too eager to appear concerned. It was a kind of behavior that rang false to those who knew him best. But no one had suspected him. Not yet. Not until the investigators began to dig deeper, until they started to connect the dots between his erratic behavior and the escalating tension between him and Maria. And then came the revelation that would change everything. The police had been able to trace Kyle's movements through surveillance footage from the school and surrounding areas. Though there were large gaps in the footage due to the outdated security system, the investigators were able to piece together a disturbing pattern. Kyle had been near the school the night Maria disappeared, his presence confirmed by nearby cameras that had captured him wandering the campus well after hours. He had been there when everyone else had gone home, when the halls were empty and the lights were dim. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was intentional. Kyle had been waiting for something or someone. The detectives began to piece together the chilling possibility that Kyle had known exactly when Maria would be leaving the school that day. He had waited for her, perhaps watching from a distance, ready to confront her in a way he never had before. But what had happened in those final moments? What had driven Kyle to take such drastic action? The answers were unclear, but the deeper the police dug, the clearer it became that Maria's disappearance had been the result of a violent escalation of Kyle's obsession. She had been his fixation, his target, and when she began to push him away, he had seen it as a threat he needed to eliminate. The confrontation that had been building for months, that had been simmering under the surface, had finally erupted, and in the aftermath of that violent encounter, Maria had vanished. The investigation took a sharp turn as the police focused their efforts on Kyle's possible involvement. They began to interview his family and friends in an attempt to understand his motivations. His family was initially shocked at the suggestion that he might be involved in Maria's disappearance. Kyle had always been difficult to understand, but they had never imagined that he was capable of something so extreme. As they continued their investigation, they uncovered more about Kyle's troubled history, more signs that his obsession with Maria had been a culmination of years of instability, of being unable to cope with rejection, and of acting out in ways that no one had fully understood until now. In those final days before Maria's disappearance, Kyle had grown increasingly erratic, his behavior unpredictable. And while no one had connected the dots at the time, it was now clear that his obsession with Maria had been the driving force behind everything that had happened. Maria's disappearance was no longer a simple case of a missing teenager. It was a tragic culmination of a relationship gone terribly wrong, of an obsession that had spiraled out of control, and of a young man who had crossed the line in his desperate attempt to hold on to something that he could never truly have. The closer the investigators came to Kyle, the more the tension escalated. With each new piece of evidence, with every new revelation about his behavior, the case seemed to take a more sinister turn. What had once been seen as a possible missing persons case was rapidly transforming into something far more dangerous, something that spoke to the darker corners of human obsession and the terrifying things that could happen when those boundaries were crossed. The emotional weight of the case began to hit harder, especially when it became clear that the tragic disappearance of Maria Rodriguez had been anything but random. Kyle had always been on the fringes of society, the kind of person who never quite fit in. He was a quiet, brooding type, someone who was always just a little too distant, a little too strange for people to get close to. The signs had always been there: his sudden, unpredictable bursts of anger, his inability to connect with others, his obsessive tendencies. But no one had really paid attention to the subtle clues. In high school, it was easy to dismiss these behaviors as the quirks of an outcast. But the more the police dug into Kyle's life, the clearer it became that his isolation and emotional instability had been brewing for years, only to manifest in a tragic and terrifying way. As the investigation deepened, the police turned their focus to Kyle's life outside of school. They interviewed his family and his acquaintances, hoping to shed light on the kind of person he was when the school bell didn't ring, and he wasn't caught in the social spotlight of high school life. What they learned only added to the growing sense of dread. Kyle's home life had been tumultuous. His parents, both of whom worked long hours, had never been able to provide the stability or emotional support he desperately needed. Kyle had spent much of his childhood bouncing between foster homes, each one more unstable than the last. He had never had a strong sense of belonging, never been able to build lasting relationships. His history of troubled behavior wasn't just confined to high school. It had started long before. Kyle had developed a pattern of fixating on certain people, typically those who were kind to him, offering him some semblance of acceptance in a world where he often felt invisible. But instead of building healthy connections, these fixations grew into something more obsessive and controlling. His inability to understand boundaries was evident in how he clung to people, unwilling to accept rejection, unable to cope with the idea that someone might want to be left alone. His obsession with Maria was merely the latest in a long line of attachments, but this time it had escalated. This time it had crossed the line from simple fascination to something much darker. Maria had been kind to him once, a rare moment where she had offered him the briefest of gestures that might have been interpreted as compassion. But for someone like Kyle, that simple act of kindness had turned into an overwhelming sense of ownership. It had been an invitation in his mind to become a part of her life, to insert himself into her world in a way that no one else had ever allowed him to. But when Maria started to pull away, when she started to reject his advances, to distance herself from him, Kyle's fixation turned into something more desperate, more volatile. It was no longer about trying to form a bond. It was about control, about forcing her to accept him no matter the cost. Maria, like many young people, had been trying to navigate the complexities of relationships. She had her own social circle, her own aspirations, her own fears and doubts. But Kyle's presence had begun to loom over her, increasingly invasive, increasingly impossible to ignore. She had done what she could to protect herself, but there was only so much she could do. Her friends hadn't realized how much Kyle's presence was affecting her, and even Maria herself hadn't fully understood how deeply his obsession had taken root until it was too late. It wasn't just that she was trying to avoid him. It was that she had begun to fear him, fear of his reactions, fear of his inability to take no for an answer, fear of his growing desperation. But the real horror came after the argument that had been dismissed at the time as nothing more than a trivial confrontation between two high school students had, in fact, been the moment where everything changed. It had been the tipping point, the catalyst that sent Kyle spiraling into a dangerous territory. After that argument, Maria had done everything she could to avoid him, to create distance. But Kyle had never been the type to simply walk away. His need for control, his desire to possess, had only intensified, and as the investigation would later reveal, it wasn't just about rejection. It was about losing what he had convinced himself was his to control. Maria had unwittingly become the focal point of his emotional breakdown, and she had paid the price. The police pieced together a chilling timeline. Kyle had spent the days leading up to Maria's disappearance watching her from a distance, obsessing over her every move. He had begun showing up at the school even when he wasn't supposed to be there, lurking in hallways, hiding in corners, waiting for a moment when he could get close to her again. His behavior was erratic, his emotional state volatile. And all the while, Maria had been unaware of just how dangerous his fixation had become. She had thought she was safe, thought she had distanced herself enough to avoid further conflict. But Kyle had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The day Maria disappeared, Kyle had been there. He had known exactly where she would be and when she would leave the school. The police later uncovered security footage that showed Kyle lingering near the school, just outside the view of the cameras. He was waiting for her, watching her as she made her way down the hallway. And then, when she turned the corner and walked out of view, it was as though the narrative of her life had been interrupted by something entirely new, something that no one could have predicted. It was at that moment, when the footage cut to static, that everything changed. It wasn't just a coincidence that the footage had cut out right when Maria had disappeared from view. Investigators soon learned that Kyle had been involved in the tampering of the school's security system. He had found a way to manipulate the cameras, to disrupt the recording at precisely the moment when Maria had been alone. The interruption in the footage had been no accident. It had been intentional. Kyle had planned it. He had known that this moment was his chance, and he had taken it. The police began to theorize that Kyle had followed Maria that day, that he had confronted her in the hallway, in the place where the cameras couldn't see. What had happened in those final moments was a mystery, but the evidence was beginning to point in one direction. Maria had tried to run. She had tried to escape, but Kyle and his obsession had caught up with her. What had started as a simple confrontation between two classmates had escalated into something far more horrifying. And it seemed that, in those final moments, Maria had paid the ultimate price for rejecting someone who had never understood the boundaries of love or desire. The emotional impact on Maria's family was unbearable. Her mother, Eva, was distraught, unable to comprehend how her daughter's life could have been taken so violently. The pain of losing her was compounded by the slow, grueling realization that Maria had been alone in those final moments, trying to escape a person who had been fixated on her in ways no one had understood. The loss was not just of a daughter. It was of a future that would never come to be. Eva had always dreamed of watching Maria grow, seeing her succeed, seeing her live a full life. But now, all of that was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of Kyle's obsession. As the investigation continued, the focus on Kyle became more and more intense. The police were able to piece together his movements leading up to the disappearance, uncovering his presence near the school at the critical time. And as they dug deeper, they found more disturbing evidence of his behavior. Kyle had left a trail of obsession in his wake. Messages to Maria that had gone unanswered, strange notes that he had written and left in places where she would find them. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that Kyle had never seen Maria as a person. He had seen her as an object, something to be controlled, something to be kept. The emotional toll of the case began to weigh heavily on everyone involved. The investigators, the family, the community, everyone felt the weight of what had happened. Maria's disappearance was no longer just a case of a missing teenager. It was a reminder of the hidden dangers that could exist in the most ordinary of places. It was a painful illustration of what can happen when obsession goes unchecked, when someone fails to understand the limits of another person's autonomy. Maria had tried to protect herself, but in the end, she had been caught in a web spun by someone who couldn't accept rejection. And in those final moments, when everything had come crashing down, she had become just another victim of an obsession that had gone too far. The investigation was far from over, but one thing had become undeniable. Kyle was at the center of it all, and the emotional cost of his actions would haunt everyone involved for years to come. As the investigation continued, a dark and unnerving sense of inevitability began to pervade the air. Kyle's involvement in Maria's disappearance seemed to be not just a possibility, but a grim certainty. Every new discovery added weight to the burden of proof that was stacking against him. Yet, even with the mounting evidence, there was still a terrifying void. No one truly knew what had happened to Maria after she left the view of the security cameras. The uncertainty of those final moments, the unanswered questions that lingered in the air like a suffocating fog, gnawed at the investigators and Maria's family. And with every piece of information that came to light, it became harder to shake the sense that something more, something far darker, was hiding just beneath the surface. The discovery of Kyle's manipulations of the school security footage had been a pivotal moment in the investigation. It had turned the tide, confirming the suspicions that had been lurking in the back of the detectives' minds. Kyle had been present, waiting for a precise moment when Maria would be alone. It was almost as if he had orchestrated the entire event, crafting a situation where he could control the outcome. That fact, chilling in its own right, only raised more terrifying questions. Why had Kyle gone to such lengths to manipulate the footage? What had he intended to do with Maria when he found her, alone and vulnerable? The deeper the investigators dug into Kyle's past, the more they realized how much his life had been marked by a pattern of obsession, rejection, and violence. His troubled upbringing, his time in foster care, his inability to maintain meaningful relationships. These were not just the marks of a troubled teenager. They were the marks of someone whose emotional instability had festered unchecked for years. He had never learned how to handle the feelings that came with rejection or emotional distance. His mind, instead of developing mechanisms for healthy coping, had nurtured a deep-rooted belief that he was entitled to the affection of others, that no one could truly turn him away. Maria had been his latest fixation, and when she began to reject him, the fragile wall that held his impulses together began to crumble. As the investigation into Kyle's actions grew more intense, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. He had been living in a world of his own, one where boundaries were fluid, and control was the only currency that mattered. It was as if he viewed Maria as a piece of property, something that belonged to him by virtue of his obsession. The idea that she could walk away from him, that she could make decisions for herself, had been incomprehensible to him. He had never learned to process the idea that someone might have autonomy over their own choices. This mindset, combined with his volatile emotional state, made for a terrifying mix. Kyle's fixation on Maria was not just a passing infatuation of an insecure teenager. It was an obsession that had consumed him entirely. As the weeks went by, Maria had grown more and more withdrawn. She had become an expert at avoiding Kyle, finding subtle ways to distance herself from him. She avoided places she knew he frequented, skipped social events where she knew he might show up. But even in her efforts to escape, Maria could feel the invisible pressure that Kyle had placed on her. It was suffocating. Every time she walked to the halls of the school, she could feel his presence, like a shadow that never left her side. It was the kind of pressure that builds slowly, quietly, until it becomes something unshakable. Maria's friends noticed a change in her, but they didn't understand what was really going on. They assumed it was just another episode of teenage drama, that Maria was going through a phase or dealing with the normal anxieties that came with high school. They didn't realize that the anxiety she was experiencing was something far darker. They didn't see the constant weight she carried, the fear that someone was always watching, always waiting for her to slip up. It wasn't until after her disappearance that they began to connect the dots, to understand just how much Kyle's presence had been affecting her. By then, it was too late. The police learned that in the days before Maria's disappearance, she had started to make plans for the future. It was as though she had known something was coming, as though she realized that she could no longer stay in the same place, trapped by the specter of Kyle's obsession. She had made plans to leave town, to go somewhere where she could escape the pressure and start over. But these plans had been made in secret, never spoken aloud to anyone. Maria had been careful, perhaps try to hold on to the last shred of control in a situation that had long since spiraled out of her grasp. The tragedy of Maria's situation was not just the loss of her life, but the fact that she had been silenced in a way no one could have predicted. She had been slowly suffocated by fear, by a person who could not see her as anything other than an object to possess. And when she finally tried to escape, to take control of her own destiny, it was too late. Kyle had already been waiting for that moment. His obsession had reached a point where nothing else mattered. He was no longer capable of seeing her as a human being, as a person with her own rights and desires. To him, Maria was simply an extension of himself, someone who existed only to fulfill his needs. The investigation into Maria's disappearance became more urgent as the police began to piece together the timeline of Kyle's movements. It was clear that he had been stalking her in the days leading up to her vanishing, watching her from the shadows, waiting for the moment when he could finally confront her. But the true horror came when the police uncovered a message from Kyle, a message that had been left on Maria's phone just hours before she disappeared. It was a simple message, a short text that read, "You can't hide from me. I'll find you." The message sent a chill through the investigators. It was chilling not because of its direct threat, but because of the cold, emotionless way in which it was written. There was no sense of urgency, no panic, no fear, just a statement of intent. As if Kyle saw himself as the one who was in control. The realization that he had been planning his action for days, perhaps even longer, sent shivers down the spine of everyone involved in the case. It was as though Maria's disappearance had been preordained, as though Kyle had been moving toward that moment for a long time, carefully orchestrating every detail, every move. The discovery of that text was a turning point in the investigation. The police knew that Kyle was no longer just a person of interest. They now had a solid link between him and Maria's disappearance. It was clear that he had been stalking her, that he had been tracking her movements, waiting for the opportunity to confront her in the way he had always desired. But even with this damning evidence, there was still the question of where Maria had gone, of what had happened in those final moments when she had vanished. The truth was that no one knew for sure. The emotional toll on Maria's family was unimaginable. Her mother, Eva, had spent countless sleepless nights clinging to hope, praying that her daughter would return, that this was all some tragic mistake. But as the investigation progressed, the painful reality began to set in. Maria was gone, and the man who had driven her into hiding, who had caused her to retreat into fear, was still out there, still capable of causing unimaginable harm. Every new discovery was a reminder of the darkness that had overtaken Maria's life in the final months before her disappearance. The sense of helplessness in the community was palpable. People wanted answers. They wanted justice for Maria, but no one knew where to begin. Kyle was a puzzle, a person who seemed to be hiding in plain sight, a person who had managed to evade suspicion for so long. But with every new piece of the investigation, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The more they uncovered about his behavior, his history, and his obsession with Maria, the more it became clear that the tragedy of her disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, one that had been brewing for years, waiting for the right person, the right moment, to bring it to a devastating conclusion. The investigation had now entered its most critical phase. The emotional burden of the case was taking its toll on everyone involved, but there was no turning back. The search for truth, for answers, had become a race against time. Every new piece of evidence brought them closer to understanding what had happened to Maria, but also opened up new questions, new layers of horror that no one could have anticipated. The weight of the investigation and the emotional toll it was taking on Maria's family and the investigators alike was becoming overwhelming. But the search for the truth would not stop, no matter how painful it was to uncover. And somewhere, hidden beneath the layers of this tragic story, was a terrifying reality. Maria's life had been taken by someone who had never understood her humanity, who had never seen her as a person with her own rights, her own desires, and her own future. She had been reduced to a symbol in his mind, an object to be controlled. And in the end, that was what had cost her everything. The days following the discovery of Kyle's manipulations were heavy with the weight of dread. The investigation had officially entered a darker chapter, and with each passing moment, the realization settled deeper that this was no longer just about finding a missing teenager. It was about understanding a deeper, more unsettling truth. Kyle's obsession with Maria had gone beyond the realm of youthful infatuation and spiraled into something far more sinister. The evidence was beginning to point to a disturbing conclusion: that Kyle had orchestrated Maria's disappearance, using the very systems that were meant to protect her to conceal his actions. But still, there was no clear answer as to where she had gone or what had truly happened in those final moments before she disappeared from the security footage. The sense of foreboding that enveloped the investigation grew more intense as investigators began to examine the possibility that Maria had been taken against her will. This was no longer just a case of a teenager walking away from her life. It had the hallmarks of something far more calculated, far more dangerous. The manipulation of the school security cameras was not a mere act of opportunistic deceit. It was an intentional, methodical attempt to control the narrative. Kyle had known exactly what he was doing when he disabled the cameras, and the chilling implications of that knowledge started to sink in. He had planned for this moment. He had waited for it. And when Maria finally made her move, when she attempted to escape the suffocating grip of his obsession, Kyle had been ready to snatch her from the world she had known. The emotional strain of the investigation weighed heavily on everyone involved. Each new detail uncovered about Kyle's life, his history, and his troubling behaviors was a reminder that no one had seen the warning signs early enough. No one had connected the dots between Kyle's troubled past and the violent obsession that had ultimately driven him to Maria. It was the kind of hindsight that stung with its clarity. If only someone had paid attention. If only someone had recognized the danger before it had escalated to this point. But the painful truth was that no one had. Even Maria, who had been deeply intuitive and self-aware, had been unable to fully comprehend the depths of Kyle's instability until it was too late. Her attempt to distance herself from him had been quiet, almost imperceptible, as if she knew that confronting him directly might bring out something even darker. She had made plans to leave town, to escape, to break free from the terror that had been stalking her every move. But those plans had been kept in the shadows, hidden from those who might have been able to help her. And now, with Kyle's actions casting a shadow over everything, it was too late to undo the damage that had been done. Investigators began to realize that Maria had been running out of time. She had sensed the danger, the escalating threat of Kyle's obsession, and she had begun to make plans for her future. But those plans, like the quiet acts of avoidance she had been carrying out in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, had been thwarted by Kyle's inability to accept rejection. To him, Maria's rejection was not just a personal affront. It was an affront to his very sense of identity. His need to control, to possess, had overwhelmed him. And as the investigators continued to piece together the evidence, the chilling reality of Kyle's emotional state came into sharper focus. It became clear that Kyle had been preparing for this moment for a long time. The manipulation of the security footage was just one of many steps he had taken in the final days before Maria disappeared. He had been watching her, following her, trying to predict her every move. His obsession had grown so all-consuming that he could no longer distinguish between reality and the narrative he had built in his mind. Maria was not just someone he had feelings for. She had become an extension of his desire to control, to dominate, to impose his will on someone who had once been kind to him. His distorted understanding of love had led him down a path of violence, and now there seemed to be no turning back.